Tales for Dark Nights.
Hunger by William Dalphin. Narrated by Jeff Clement. As a doctor, I'm bound by doctor-patient privilege to not disclose the specifics of what I'm about to tell you. But as a human being, I feel compelled to share. This is, without a doubt, the most horrific story I've ever had the displeasure of being a part of. It was 2009, and my schedule for that day was light. I was just finishing up my lunch when I got a call from a friend and colleague who had his own practice in the same building as me. Sometimes we would send work each other's way when we knew the other could use it. I was a bit elated at the prospect of him calling me because I'd just begun going over my books and stressing a bit.
Are you busy right now? I'd like to send someone up to you,
he said. No, my afternoon is barren. What are the details?
It's a walk-in. From the look of it, an eating disorder. Her mother is concerned.
Eating disorder. Those can be unpleasant. I'd actually had a bulimic throw up in my office once when I stepped out momentarily to check my calendar. Still, I needed the work. All right, send her up. I tried to tidy up my desk to make my office look more presentable and professional while I waited. 10 minutes ticked by and no patient showed up, so I stepped out to go looking for her. When I got to the hall, there was a small contingent of people standing around the elevator. They were talking amongst themselves. What's going on? I asked.
The elevator's broke,
someone said. Shit. I bet she's on there, I thought. What floor is it stuck on?
10th and 11th?
Yeah, that would be about right. My colleague's office was on the 10th, 3 floors down. I knew from experience that it could be anywhere up to an hour before they got the elevator working again. I hoped she wasn't claustrophobic. Returning to my office, I called downstairs.
What's up?
My colleague asked after picking up. She's stuck in the elevator. He laughed.
Really? Poor thing.
What's her name?
Amelia.
He paused.
Amelia D. something.
All right, thanks. If you got any impressions on her from your brief visit, maybe you can share them later. Over drinks?
Sure,
Don't tell me. I want to form my own opinion first.
Okay.
True to form, an hour and 10 minutes later, I heard a loud cheer from the hallway, indicating the elevator had started working again. I should go make sure she's all right, I thought to myself, and went out to join the throng of people standing around in the hallway. There were a lot more people by then, and I couldn't make my way to the elevator doors or even see them from where I was, but I could hear it when the elevator dinged, indicating it was stopping on our floor, and the rolling mechanical sound of the doors opening. There was a loud gasp from the crowd of people, followed by a lot of jabbering.
Holy shit!
Someone said quite loudly. People started hustling away from the elevator, shoving past me. I struggled against the tide and made my way to where a number of people were standing around, staring into the elevator cab. As I approached, I could smell this stench. It was like stumbling into the apartment of a recluse who hadn't come out or bathed for years. It rolled like a wave out of the elevator and cascaded over everyone in the hallway. A young man in a business suit who looked dressed for an interview was covering his mouth and nose with a handkerchief. I skirted around him to see into the elevator. The woman in the elevator was not at all what I was expecting. Massively obese, she looked like she weighed somewhere around 500-600 pounds. Her face was so puffed up, her eyes were barely visible, just 2 dark dots above her cheeks. She had frizzed out brown hair that still had curlers in it. The notion that I was smelling a recluse seemed all the more plausible at the sight of her. Her mouth was covered with what looked like greasy barbecue sauce. There was even some sort of gristle at the corners of her lips. There was more of it all over her hands and wiped down the front of her shirt. It looked like she had come straight from an all-you-can-eat rib buffet. Clenched tightly in one of her hands was a big black trash bag that sagged full of something that seemed to slosh around inside it. The smell coming out of it was nauseating. The woman stepped out of the elevator, her eyes and nose running with tears and mucus. I stepped forward while everyone else backed away, horrified. "Amelia?" I asked her. She looked at me through her beady little piggy eyes, her cheeks covered with that vile red gunk and streaking with tears, and opened her mouth. For about 3 seconds, I had the horrible notion that she was going to vomit an entire barbecue on me.
I was hungry,"
she stuttered with a thick southern accent. The young man in the suit heaved involuntarily at the smell of her breath, and then strode away trying to maintain his demeanor. "That's okay. Do you want to talk about it in my office?" I said, reaching out to help her. Seeing me reach out to her, she clenched her black trash bag tightly and hugged it to her chest. The contents of it made a sickening squish sound. I could taste my own lunch in the back of my throat. "Is that yours?" I asked. "I'm not going to take it." She started sobbing, this horrible, almost hob-like squeal of a sob. Honestly, I didn't want to touch her. I wanted to go back into my office, lock the door, and pretend I was glad my afternoon was completely empty. The smell wafting off her and off that bag of spoils was going to be permeating every crevice of my office for days. I just knew it. Still, this was a human being that had come seeking my help, and I was not about to turn her away. "My office is right down the hall. Why don't you come with me?" I started walking. In my head, I said, if she doesn't come with me, fuck it. She can go back to her apartment that's probably filled with roaches and feces and who knows what other ungodly things, and I'll find someone else to help. But she followed me, lumbering on legs that stretched the limits of the sweatpants she had on. I held the door open for her and she waddled in, kneading the contents of that trash bag in her thick sausage fingers, making it belch and splurch. She stopped and just stood there in the middle of my office.
The elevator got stuck,"
she mumbled. "Yes, I'm sorry about that. I hope you were all right. Thank goodness you brought something to eat, yes?" She started crying again, squeezing her trash bag, and I was afraid it was going to explode and leave God knows what all over my office floor. She nodded as her face turned red and tears poured out of seemingly every pore of her head. I went and got her a box of tissues and handed her a couple. She tried to take them while still holding onto the bag with both hands. "Would you like me to hold that?" I offered, praying she'd say no. She shook her head. "What do you have in there?" I finally decided to ask. She huffed and snorted, trying to inhale all the fluid back into her face. Using one of the tissues, she mopped her eyes and mouth, getting blotchy red smears all over the place.
"Leftovers,"
she stuttered. Then her chest started heaving, and she threw her head back and started bawling again. Her face was like a fountain. She was so utterly miserable, and I really started to feel bad for her. "Look," I said, "getting stuck in that elevator was obviously pretty traumatic." Her wailing hit a crescendo. "So why don't we postpone things until you've calmed down a bit?" She struggled through her sobbing.
You want to meet with me?
"Well, yes, but not today. Why don't you go home and try to relax? I don't think you're in the right frame of mind right now to talk. So let's schedule an appointment for later this week. How does that sound?" I walked back to my desk and got out one of my cards. Her mouth was quivering and she looked ready to collapse into a pile of screaming phlegm, but she was calming down a bit, just nodding more than anything. And she took my card with the same sticky fingers holding several drippy tissues.
Thank you,
she said quietly. I couldn't read her face at all. Her features were so red and swollen and wet that she seemed almost blank and expressionless. "Do you want me to escort you down to the lobby?" I asked, "in case something happens with the elevator again? It should be all right, but I don't want you to be nervous." She shook her head.
That doesn't seem like a good idea.
"Okay." And with that, she turned around and waddled out of my office, slowly, sobbing slightly every now and then. With her went that sloshy black trash bag, and with them both went that putrid aroma of filth and squalor. I literally breathed a sigh of relief as I heard the door click shut. She never called me back. It was a week later that I finally got around to having drinks with my colleague from downstairs. We were relaxing, having a couple beers, and I suddenly remembered her. "Oh, thanks, by the way," I said.
For what?
"For Amelia."
Who?
"Amelia. Eating disorder. Last week you sent her up to me, remember?"
Oh, right.
He sipped his beer.
The one who got stuck in the elevator. How did that go?
"She was a wreck," I said, sobbing and practically hysterical. I talked her into rescheduling, but she hasn't called me to make an appointment.
Did you talk to her mother?
No, I didn't get any information from her. I gave her my card.
What did you think?
He asked. "Classic food dependency," I said. "Definitely a binge eater." Her face was just all...
No, not the mother, I mean Amelia.
"What?"
What did you think of Amelia?
He said again. "I'm telling you what I thought."
Amelia, the scrawny 12-year-old girl, you think is a binge eater?
"What? No, that's not..." And then it hit me. Was her mother with her?
Yeah, I sent them both up to you.
They were in the elevator together? He looked at me, and the same dawning realization came over his face. Needless to say, she never rescheduled. Amelia D. something. Nor did her mother, the nameless, obese woman I met that day at the elevator, smelling like death, covered in gore, and carrying her trash bag of sloshing leftovers.
Home. Written by Jeffrey Ebright. Narrated by Otis Gyrie. Featuring Mr. Creepypasta. Music and audio production by Jeff Clement. The early morning sun poked through my window, let me know it was time to get to work. I yawned, stretched, and put on a pair of shorts with a t-shirt. I could hear the cardinals chirping hello to the serene August morning. It was already in the mid-60s, which meant a very warm and humid day would be on its way. The kids would be here soon, and I needed to make sure everything was ready for the weekend. As the sun inched over the horizon and burned away the morning haze, I checked the cabins and found everything in place for the new campers. Food packed the cabinets and freezers in the mess hall, enough for a large contingent of children. This would be the last weekend of summer camp for the year. Once these kids were gone, the Winoka Nature Reserve would be shuttered and forgotten until spring returned to claim the reserve from winter's icy grip. I checked the list Roger had given me at the beginning of the camp season. I went through the list of participants and stopped at the last unchecked date. This weekend, I would help host the boys of St. Michael's Orphanage. Sorry, we don't use the word orphanage anymore. Political correctness sent out a memo calling St. Michael's a foster child care center. It doesn't matter what name they give it. St. Michael's houses all the unwanted children from broken and abandoned families. These kids were the modern-day wretched refuse the Statue of Liberty talks about on its base. If not for the sizable donation from the Joseph Swift Foundation, these kids would never step foot in Camp Winoka. They were truly the lost souls, and if not for a few caring individuals, would have slipped through the cracks of society without concern. For most of the camping season, snot-nosed rich kids ran around Winoka like they were personally responsible for nature itself. They were privileged, spoiled, and couldn't give a rat's ass about communing with nature and its wonders. The upside to those little rich kids was the money their parents shelled out for us to entertain and amuse their rotten brats for a week. Their cash kept Camp Winoka running and afforded the opportunity to bring in less fortunate kids for camp. Although most of these young souls had never been out of the city, they appreciated the commune with forest life. After 30 years as camp caretaker, this was my payment, seeing the wonder in their eyes when presented with the majesty of nature. With everything in order, I jumped on the camp's ATV and drove back to my Airstream trailer nestled off the camp proper. Looking in my bathroom mirror, I was a little unkempt. I swept back my salt and pepper hair, tied a rubber band around my ponytail, brushed out my beard, dabbed on some deodorant, and slipped into a clean yellow polo shirt with the camp crest. It was about 8 a.m., and the camp would come to life with new explorers soon. I fired up the ATV and went to base camp to await the last campers of the season. I had just finished a Red Delicious when I heard the bus rolling down the dirt road. The Winoka Nature Reserve was an isolated slice of forest in the southeast corner of Ohio. It covered over 400 acres of privately protected woods and wildlife. Hiking trails wound through the forest without a telephone pole or a skyscraper littering the landscape. The cabins, mess hall, and even the suspension bridge across Taylor Ravine were all built with solid 19th century ingenuity. A single dirt road was the only way in or out of the reserve. Roger was the first off the bus. As usual, he was filled with energy and covered in summer sweat. Although most counselors were teenagers trying to add a community service star to their college transcript, Roger had fallen in love with Camp Winoka and decided to make it a yearly commitment. He was an able-bodied guy, so I appreciated the help.
Jackson, how's it going, you old mountain man?
Roger thrust out a hand. I shook it. Everything's primed and ready to roll, Roger. While the other counselors tended to the kids, Roger slung an arm around my neck and walked me away from the unloading bus.
Listen, Jackson, there are 22 kids this year, all boys, so we can use cabins A, B, C, and we'll leave cabin D empty. There's a couple rowdy ones, but nothing we can't handle. After all, if we can't handle 24 kids for 3 days, we're in the wrong business.
He laughed and looked at me with a concerned expression.
How's your arthritis?
Good days and bad, Roger, I supplied, but nothing to keep me out of the game.
Good to hear. I'll get with you when the kids are done settling in, and we can go over the schedule. Here's to a great weekend.
He slapped me on the back and returned to the bus. The kids unloaded and settled into their assigned cabins without incident. From the checklist Roger gave me, the kids were 9 to 13 years old, most in the lower part of the age range. Just like every year, we gathered them together in the mess hall for introductions before lunch.
Good afternoon, campers.
Roger cheerfully bellowed. He was met with a semi-enthusiastic hello by the campers.
My name is Roger Lovek, but you can call me Roger. I am the head counselor for your stay at Camp Winnica, and this...
He pointed to the 4 yellow-shirted counselors.
...is Gary, Glenn, Mitch, and Tom. And this is Mountain Man Jackson.
He pointed to me.
He takes care of the campground all year long and keeps it looking great. If you ever have any problems during your stay, please let myself or one of these men know. We are here to make sure that you have fun and stay safe.
Roger glanced to his clipboard.
With that in mind, we do have a few rules.
The children heaved a collective sigh.
Come on, guys. The rules are here for your protection. The nearest city is 45 minutes away. The nearest hospital is over an hour. Play safe, stay safe, right? Rule number 1. Everyone needs to be in their assigned cabin by 9 o'clock. When you're in the wilderness, the temperature drops about 20 degrees once the sun sets. Unlike the city, there's no streetlights. It gets really dark and very cold quickly. Rule number 2. Every camper will be assigned a buddy. Your buddy is to be with you at all times. Well, unless you're going to the bathroom.
Everybody chuckled at this.
Rule 3. Unless you're being led by a counselor, stick to the blue paths. If you look at your packets, you'll see the paths I'm talking about. Blue paths are safe to walk with your buddy. Red paths are trails approved for walking only when a counselor is with you. The black paths are off limits and are for staff members only. Rule number 4. Trail bikes, paddle boats, and canoes are available on a first-come, first-served basis. The sign-up sheet is located on the bulletin board outside the main cabin. We put up a new sheet after dinner for the next day of unscheduled activity time. And, before you ask, the ATV is for counselor use only. Rule number 5, be respectful of your counselors and fellow campers. We have opened this once-in-a-lifetime chance to enjoy nature. Take advantage of it, not the people around you, and you'll have a great time. What do you say?
The kids offered a civil round of applause. Roger waited for the smattering to die down.
And this year, we are offering a special surprise to the best campers. We will be choosing 6 of the best campers for a Sunday night excursion to the Light of Hope Ruins.
Some kids smiled and nodded.
I can see some of you know the legend. We'll be camping there for the night with an open pit cookout, s'mores, and maybe, just maybe, do a little ghost hunting. How does that sound?
The kids erupted in applause and whistles. I couldn't help but chuckle to myself.
Great! Be on your best behavior, and you can be one of the chosen few. Now, let's all get in line for lunch. We have a lot to see today.
The kids continued to applaud as they lined up for the afternoon meal. I never minded putting meals together when I was in the Army, so it was an easy task. Every day, one of the counselors was assigned to KP with me. Unfortunately, they usually bitched and moaned about it. I never understood that attitude. I mean, get it over with. Don't drag it out by complaining the whole time. Besides, these kids were grateful to have a bologna sandwich, fruit cup, and celery with peanut butter. It was those rich kids that had special menu requests that was the real pain. Needless to say, there are no vegetarians when you're poor. The next couple of days flew by without incident. I'll be honest, I've never seen a group of lightly supervised kids not get into a little mischief when the counselor wasn't around. I guess the Light of Hope camp out was a real draw. For those of you who do not watch those ghost hunting programs, the Light of Hope ruins are one of those places that have spawned many supernatural myths around them. This made life hellish for me. Matter of fact, I spent the majority of my off-season time running off idiots with their ghost-detecting equipment because if anyone gets hurt, the sanctuary would be liable for any injuries sustained. However, it never stopped anyone from spinning a yarn about a campfire or two about the place the media calls Gore Orphanage. Light of Hope was located 3/4 of a mile from the main campground, close to the interstate annex. The 6 winners were easy to choose and were elated when we called their names at the Saturday night assembly. The kids were a bit skittish due to the fact that we had to take one of the black paths through the dense woods, but Roger and I made sure they tucked their pant legs into their socks to prevent ticks and chiggers from getting a free ride to the campsite.
Mr. Jackson, what's that?
Close to the campsite, a kid named Connor Watson pointed into the woods where a clearing appeared. See those old markers? That was a graveyard over 100 years ago, I said.
That's creepy.
The boy had a worried face as I patted his head. Don't worry, Connor. Ghosts don't exist. You're safe. For now. I offered him a wink. We made the site about an hour before sunset and set to the task of putting up the 2 tents. Each tent could fit 8 people comfortably, but were a bit of a pain to set up due to the remnants of brick and stone left from 100 years ago. By the time we had them up, the sun had mostly melted into the horizon. The 6 winners were a bit rowdy and anxious, but we kept them occupied. Roger took half the kids out to forage wood for the campfire, while I took the other half to help prepare dinner. Although Connor was not too happy about deer stew, the others were unaffected. Mark Treasure acted as almost ghoulish in his desire to try it. We set the gallon pot above a healthy fire. Even though every kid was thinking about Gore Orphanage, none of them asked about it. By the time we were ready for s'mores, they were practically chomping at the bit for a ghost story. I served the kids some homemade apple cider I warmed over the fire to keep the cold away while they finished their chocolate, graham cracker, marshmallow treats. Roger decided he would begin weaving the supernatural tale.
So, has anyone ever heard of Gore Orphanage?
All hands went up.
But does anyone know why it's called Gore Orphanage?
Most of the kids shrugged.
Well, back in the late 1800s, there was an orphanage located on this very spot. You see the bricks and timbers lying around our campsite, right?
They all nodded.
It was once a huge building that housed almost 200 children. It was originally called the Light of Hope Orphanage.
I jumped in. These kids they took in weren't good kids like you. They were mostly runaways and kids that weren't right in the head, and some were downright mean. But they were too young to go to prison, so the authorities put in Light of Hope for rehabilitation. You kids know about what that means. Some nodded, intently listening. That means they hoped the orphanage could help them become good, productive citizens.
But some couldn't be rehabilitated.
Roger sighed.
Some children were dangerous and had to be chained up at bedtime. Some children were locked downstairs in the basement and were only allowed out for an hour a day. The worst of them were isolated in small, lightless parts of the basement and never allowed to play with other children.
The worst of them was a kid by the name of Lowell Frudd, I continued. Think of the meanest kid you know. Now, times that kid by 10. That's how mean he was. Nobody knows what made him so mean or if he was born with the spirit of the devil with him. His first night in Light of Hope, he bit off another kid's ear. They tried chaining him, but he'd pick the locks and hurt other kids. So they put him downstairs where he got free again. This time he hurt a kid so bad that by the time the orderlies got him to the infirmary, the kid was almost dead.
Lowell had broken every finger and toe on the kid, joint by joint,
added Roger.
And then he started on the kid's limbs, snapping his arms and legs one by one.
Roger accentuated this by breaking some dry sticks and tossing them into the campfire. As you can guess, Lowell had become far too dangerous to leave around other kids, I offered. The people in charge decided to lock him away in the basement. They put him in a straitjacket and only let him out for a shower once a month. When they let him to take a shower, they'd also wash down his cell. Let's just say he didn't have the cleanest of bathroom habits.
But how did he eat?
Connor, the youngest of the Winters, asked.
Good question. Once a day, an orderly would bring in a bottle of liquid food, oatmeal or gruel, and force a tube down his throat. They'd empty the bottle straight into his stomach. That method worked until he bit off one of the orderly's fingers. After that, they had to strap him down to feed him.
Come on.
Mark Traeger, the oldest of the Winters, rolled his eyes in disbelief. It's true. A quick, serious look put Mark's doubt in check. They used an old, rusty C-clamp to force his mouth open. Lowell fought them, but only succeeded in breaking off pieces of his teeth. They found records where orderlies refused to feed Lowell because of his creepy, jagged-toothed smile.
Oh yeah, I forgot about that, Jackson.
Roger hid a laugh at my improvisation behind a cough.
Everyone that came in contact with Lowell Frudd was convinced that he had the devil in him. But what could they do? The only way to leave the orphanage was either through an adoption or when they turned 18. People knew no one would adopt Lowell, and it was many years before he was old enough to legally leave. So in that small basement cell he stayed, and years passed.
Roger suddenly stood up.
Sorry, boys. I have to go relieve myself. Jackson, do you mind finishing the story?
I don't know, Roger. Do you think they can handle the rest of the story? To this, the children responded with a chorus of protests. Okay. I'll tell you the rest of the story, as long as you guys promise to clean up afterward and hit the bed. Deal? All agreed, and I passed around the rest of this steaming apple cider, while Roger headed into the woods for privacy. After a few years in the hole, the people who ran the orphanage relaxed and let Lowell out of the straitjacket. They even let him eat real food instead of pouring gruel down his throat. It looked like he might have been turning the corner and was going to make a good citizen after all. However, he had these eyes that looked like they housed the fires of hell. It unnerved everyone who met him. But he was behaving, so he got more and more privileges back, although he was still kept in the basement. Then, on an August night in 1910, a night like this one, it happened. Lowell Frudd picked the locks on his shackles. Any other person held prisoner for years would have made for the doors and escaped, but not Lowell. He went to the storage shed and got several cans of kerosene. Back then, kerosene was used in lamps instead of the light bulbs that we use today. He crept through the night, pouring gallon upon gallon of kerosene all around the building, in the hallways, and any other place he could move without drawing attention to himself. He poured a final trail of kerosene out the main doors and wedged a piece of lumber across the doors, jamming them closed. And then he put a match to the kerosene. The boys gasped. They were hooked. And in that dark night, much like this night, Lowell Frudd laughed as he watched the orderlies and children helplessly pound on the doors and windows as the flames grew taller and hotter. Survivors say he sat down on the front lawn and watched it all burn to the ground, his red eyes glowing, smiling his broken smile.
What a bunch of bull,
offered Mark. You think so? I asked. Here are the facts, young man. On that August night, 172 children and employees died, burned alive. Only 17 children and an orderly survived. By the time fire trucks responded, it was too late. All the firemen could do was watch the Light of Hope orphanage burn to the ground and listen to the dying screams of the trapped orphans. In case you've forgotten, you're sleeping in the ruins of Gore Orphanage. Oh, and there's one other fact I should share. The children all held their breath when they asked in unison, "What?" Lowell Frudd's body was never found. The local sheriff's office searched the woods for a week, but they found no survivors, nor did they find Lowell Frudd. The only trace of Lowell was where the survivor said he was sitting on the lawn. A single word was burned into the grass. Home. People say Lowell Frudd roamed the Winoka woods like an animal, wild animal, until his dying day. Some say his spirit still haunts these woods. And on certain nights, like this one, you can hear the wailing of the orphan children, warning the living when Lowell Frudd is lurking about. Wait. Listen. The kids looked at each other as the night sky covered the woods in darkness. Only the occasional crackling of the fire interrupted the silence. Almost on cue, a thin, high-pitched moan filtered through the surrounding trees.
What was that?
Connor sputtered. "I have no idea," I said flatly. "Just stay near the fire." It was then I saw Connor, mouth wide open, pointing toward the woods. One by one, the other kids followed his finger. In the tree line, 2 small red orbs the size of human eyes glowed, and from the thing in the tree line came a single guttural word. The children froze. Their panic drenched the area. The thing advanced again, and they all began shrieking, but huddled close to the fire. Mark even pulled a partially burning stick from the campfire and held it in front of him. It repeated, drawing closer to the campsite. The children were seconds away from blind panic. I exclaimed, "Lowell Frudd, it can't be!" The thing burst from the tree line and into the light of the campfire. The children offered one more unified scream before realization hit them. It was Roger.
Gotcha!
He laughed, walking up to the campfire. He showed them his glasses with the red LED lights and sat down on a log next to the fire. "You kids should know better." I couldn't contain my laughter. "Ghosts don't exist." The kids offered weak protests to the prank, but Roger and I couldn't stop laughing. Once the adrenaline surge died down, the kids complied to our wishes and went to their tents. Roger and I made sure all the boys were secure in their sleeping bags before we returned to the fire.
"That worked better than I thought,"
said Roger.
"I didn't believe you about the moaning thing."
Earlier that week, I had told Roger about how the trucks driving the interstate close to Gore Orphanage caused a sound which, when filtered through the dense forest, sounded like an otherworldly moaning. Many paranormal investigators reported it as evidence of ghosts, but it was quickly debunked as passing big rigs. However, we were going to take advantage of any free story elements we could.
"Did everybody have their fill of cider?"
Roger looked at the stack of empty cups. "No problem there." I stood and stretched. "We got a big day tomorrow. Game over."
"Is it?"
Roger smiled. The kids slept like logs. Roger and I found it difficult to wake them up, in fact. I guess I had put too many sleeping pills in the apple cider. The next morning, the kids made their groggy way back to the main camp and prepared for the return to St. Michael's. I smiled and waved at children whose names I would soon forget. Well, maybe I'd remember one. I'm sure the bus ride back to St. Michael's was uneventful. with the exception of the winners regaining their wits long enough to ask where their fellow orphan was. Roger would handle it with his usual charm, like he had done in the previous years. Probably some excuse like an asthma attack, spider bite from a brown recluse, or some such nonsense. It didn't really matter. There was always a new batch of bright-eyed junior counselors every year. A missing child on the books meant an additional $60,000 went straight into the administrator's pocket. All the angles were covered. Orphans are the lost souls of society and would never be missed. Roger joined me later that day. We strolled into a cabin, Cabin D, with uncontrollable grins. Connor Watson, eyes a mixture of uncertainty and terror, lay bound and weeping in a corner of the cabin. I told you, Connor, ghosts don't exist. But monsters? Monsters are real. I drew my knife and closed the cabin door.
I'm posting this from a masked IP at a public location. I don't want to be traced for reasons you'll soon understand. I won't give my name and I won't give my alias. It's too easily recognized in certain circles. I don't want this making its way back to my doorstep in any way, shape, or form. You can call me X. Generic, I know. But that's the point. I was a contract killer, one of the best guns for hire on the East Coast, and I had the clientele to prove it. Greedy skimmers, stonewalling employers, blackmailers, rats, moles, kingpins, even cheating husbands. I've done it all. And at a high price my customers were more than willing to pay for a job done right. I was professional and precise, methodical. No names, no personal information, no face-to-face contact, no wire transfers, cash only. Anonymity, plausible deniability, and no personal involvement. These practices kept me alive and in business, and they were the reason my name was in such high demand. When I got the call 6 months ago that started all of this, I handled it the same way as all the others. This is the transcript. I keep an encrypted database with a kill switch protocol. You never know when the info could save your skin. Now, it just serves to remind me of my mistake. Date 2013, 7:13 p.m. Tony's Greek Diner in Delhi. Takeout or delivery?
Delivery, please.
House or apartment?
Public. Parsons Place, that is. Hello?
Location?
Yes, am I speaking to Mr. Listen, my name is...
No names. Location?
Hotel, 10th floor, room... Tomorrow night, 8:30 p.m.
Description?
He's an ex-minister from St. Excommunicated for...
Physical description.
Yes, okay. He's about 6 feet tall, mid-50s, thinning, grey hair, slightly overweight, and walks with a bit of a limp. He wears glasses, has a scar over his left eye.
20,000 in unmarked 50s at the drop point. 4 hours. Your contact knows the place. Be discreet. Don't be late.
Understood. Listen, this is important. You have to know that leave special instructions with the drop.
I can't stand chatty people. They're bad for business. I don't want to know you, and you don't want to know me. Some people seem to have a hard time grasping this concept. Oh, Jesus, I shouldn't have even taken the call. When he fumbled on the password, I should have just cut the line. I wouldn't be in this mess if I had just cut the goddamned line. I could say hindsight is 20/20. I could blame the whole thing on the questionable and the unknowable, but I can't say that I wasn't warned. I just didn't listen. Didn't care to know more than necessary to the task at hand. When I collected the payment, I found more than the usual neatly stacked banknotes in a briefcase. I showed up at my contact's place of business that night, whose name I also choose to withhold, after hours in a safe room below his hardware shop where the real money was made. Shady dealings by the light of a low-hanging lamp. You'd be surprised how many people need a squeaky clean middleman who can keep his mouth shut, and I was one of his most loyal business partners. He slid the package across the desk toward me, a slightly stained gym bag lumpy with its contents. No marks for class or professionalism, but I'm sure it didn't attract any undue attention. I had to give it that much. The condition of the bag did not belie the crispness of the currency either, ruffled and frayed from who knows how many tumbles and turns. Beneath it all, I felt something heavier and more rigid. I dug around and pulled out a small book bound in something that looked like leather and felt like stone. A dusty thing with pages yellowing at the edges and blackening at the corners. I held it up to the light, confused. "What the hell is this?" I asked. He sat back and lit up a cigarette. "Hell if I know," he huffed. "But I think you need to be a little more careful with the jobs you take. The guy was a whack job. All nerves and the real liability." He paused for a long drag on his cancer stick. "Not worth the paycheck, if you ask me. No disrespect, mind you. I just hope it doesn't come back to bite you in the ass." I listened with one ear as I thumbed over the book. It was full of crude drawings, symbols, and a lot of it written in a language I didn't recognize. A letter fell from beneath the front cover as I fanned through the pages. Enclosed in fine stationery and sealed with wax like something out of the 18th century. I broke the seal and unfolded a note written on some kind of thick parchment. It read, "Mr. We sincerely apologize for involving you in this grim affair, but we have tracked Father too long and too far to fail now. We require an artful hand and a certainty that only you can afford us. That man's intentions are a profound betrayal and a dire sin, and his death matters more than your life or mine. There exists a world in the shadow of our own, a world of those who would do us harm, who seek a dark eternity for us all. He would loose them upon us. Please know that yours is a vital task, and that a much grander fate rests in your hands. No matter the outcome, we humbly thank you for your service and your sacrifice. Go with God, and may your aim be true. With admiration." This is some cult shit, man. I almost laughed. Is he serious? People don't leave massive bags of cash lying around when they're joking, he replied with a shrug. Shaking my head, I tossed the cryptic items aside and got back to business. I gave the cash my usual once-over, a quick flip-through, checking for serial numbers and signs of counterfeit, then tossed him a small stack of large bills for his trouble. I didn't bother with a meticulous count. That was his job, and I trusted him. We'd had a lucrative arrangement for several years, and he wouldn't jeopardize the loss of my business, let alone his life, over such a petty sum. With a mildly annoyed tip of the hat, I took my leave to make preparations. I almost made it to the front door before he tried to sell me on a new line of garden shovels he had gotten in stock that morning. You know, just in case I found myself in need of a quick disposal. He knew that part wasn't my job or my problem, but it never stopped him from trying to make an extra buck at my expense. In fact, his sales pitches had become a routine part of my visits, as had my refusals. I decided to make my post at a nondescript office building 2 city blocks from the hotel, one of several I had identified and favored for their easy roof access and lazy contracted security. I showed up an hour early, enough time to set up shop and account for the typical human lack of punctuality. The sun had already nearly set, and the cover of night was a boon of which I always took full advantage, given the opportunity. I walked through the door in a mild gray suit and tie, slight 5 o'clock shadow, false mustache, and a salt and pepper wig. The visage of a middle-aged, constipated stiff, opting for a late night at the office to avoid sharing a bed with his hag of a wife. My medium-sized briefcase didn't so much as raise an eyebrow as I approached the guard at the front desk. I passed him the doctored security pass I'd lifted off a careless employee earlier that day. I also took the time to make small talk, some bullshit about being transferred in for a week on a joint venture project and hating the hours. I find that friendly conversation usually instills more trust than a badge. I made my way straight to the roof, prepared to cover the security cameras, of which there were none. I found no use for my lockpicking set with the unlocked door, stepped through and found a good corner spot with no safety railing and a clear view of the hotel's west wing. The landlord was just begging for a lawsuit when some idiot wandered up for the scenery and took a fall, but that carelessness was exactly why I chose the place. I opened the briefcase's polished latches and pulled the parts from their black foam inserts one at a time. The folding thumbhole stock clicked tightly into the upper assembly. I fitted the lower receiver and trigger housings to the forward grip. I slid the scope onto the mod rail and tightened the clamps. I screwed in and secured the barrel, then ported the sound suppression jacket. I slid the bolt into the upper assembly. I paused for a moment and considered what I was doing. The note and book had scarcely left my mind since the night before, and the more I'd thought about it, the more I chastised myself for taking such a stupid job. A lot of what I did relied on the confidentiality of people who had the common sense to keep our business to themselves. My contact was right. This guy was clearly out of his mind, and I was taking a huge risk by involving myself in their affairs, even at an anonymous level. I mean, was I really about to clip a holy man over some delusional fantasy of spiritual warfare? Did this man really have to die out of fear that he may summon some kind of demon? I knew better than to let any moral conflict bother me. I knew it was just a job, but this was ridiculous. Did I really want to get involved with these nut jobs? What the hell had I gotten myself into? I guess it wasn't my place to judge. Sure, there may have been better reasons to end a life, but I was just the hired hand. A car washer doesn't question a man who brings in his clean ride for a detail, right? A pharmacist doesn't question a thin woman buying weight loss supplements. Besides, I had never backed out of a job before, and I didn't plan to start. If my reputation was gonna take a hit one way or the other, I had might as well make good on my end of the deal. I checked the feed mechanism and loaded the magazine. 6 rounds, .308 caliber, modified charge. I focused the lens and scoped my range. I closed and locked the bolt, and the round was loaded. The recoil pad sat firmly against my shoulder, and the weight of the rifle balanced on the bipod. I rested my thumb over the safety. I took a deep breath, and I waited. As I stared through the scope into the room, the last rays of sunlight provided just enough clarity to make out a few important details. Clearly, the guy had occupied the room for some time, and he'd been busy. Just about every inch of the walls had been covered in the same gibberish from that book, written in what looked like permanent marker. He had torn up the carpeting and covered the floors in all manner of pentagrams and other circular symbols. At the center of each sat a variety of objects, including candles, piles of plants and rocks, and bowls filled with a number of different liquids. Last, but certainly not least, was the bed. It had been stripped down to the mattress, which had been painted over with one last, incredibly intricate pentagram, and thick iron chains and shackles trailed from the bedposts. Oh, sick bastard. The scene was almost cartoonish, really. The kind of thing you'd expect to see in a bad horror film or a haunted house. I wasn't keen on the idea of harming the mentally ill, but I figured he'd be better off if I put him out of his misery. Before I had much time to admire his work, my mark stepped through the door, lighting enough candles on his way in to give the entire room a flickering orange glow. He looked neurotic, fidgety and sweaty, and he constantly darted his gaze over his shoulder. I had a clear shot, and I should have just taken it, but I was struck with morbid curiosity. So I followed his movements around the room, the crosshairs constantly hovering over his eye. I watched his deranged ritual unfold, watched as he fretted over the minute placement of the random items around him, watched as he rubbed his hands together and gnashed his teeth in nervous anticipation. I watched as he muttered prayers into the open air from a book that looked much like mine, and watched as a laughable practice of a mad obsession turned to true horror. As the ritual pressed on, I began to feel the goings-on in that room for myself. And I mean that in the most literal sense. Something had gripped me. Something otherworldly, and the scope of my rifle became a portal of forced witness to the blasphemous and obscene. The cool breeze around me turned to the musty heat of candles and sweat. The scent of a gritty urban summer turned to the stench of his labors and the filth of his room. And the sounds of the roaring traffic below turned to his muffled mutterings and the banging struggle of someone or something behind the bathroom door. Though at a great distance, and though the crosshairs still marched over his left eye, I was suddenly there. I watched as he dragged the source of the noise from the bathroom, heard his grunts and his victim's muffled cries through the duct tape over her mouth as he dragged her to the bed, and heard the rattling of shackles as he unbound her limbs one by one, only to restrain them once again. She lay splayed out across the mattress, donning a wrinkled and stained nightgown, likely the nightwear in which she was abducted. She was to be some unseen something's sacrificial meal, and the candle flames wafted and dimmed in the growling breeze of its hunger. My vigil's hold released me, but only for a moment. Long enough to feel my index finger lightly caress the curve of the trigger, long enough to slow my hastened breath. I watched him press his hand against his mouth and pace about the room as he considered the gruesome next step. I could hear the anxious skittering and shuffling of the demons now, seeming to come from the very shadows on the wall, and many shrill voices chattered pleas for their feast. They grew irritated with his hesitation. I saw the terror in his victim's eyes as she caught the sheen of a blade drawn from his belt, a brutal dagger with a serrated edge, and she struggled against her shackles until her skin began to tear and bleed. I watched him approach her slowly, with a look of sorrow and remorse upon his face, apparently an unwilling prisoner in this deed. My finger gently pressed the trigger as I watched him raise it over his head, poised for a downward thrust. The creatures in the shadows hissed and moaned their approval. He stayed his hand for several moments, as did I, until his resolve crumbled. He stumbled back and dropped the knife, and he covered his face in tears of personal disgust. The creatures from the shadows wailed and shrieked with fury, and the room began to quake around him, shaking cabinet doors open and tossing aside the objects about the floor. The candles flared and raged. My panic released my mind, hurtling back to my own body, and adrenaline coursed through my veins. The sound suppression jacket made a harsh thump of a gunshot, and the left side of the priest's face shattered into a cloud of red mist as he fell limp and went crashing to the floor. Just as his head made contact with the hard wood, the candles extinguished in unison with one violent flicker, and silence and darkness befell the room. I cycled the bolt, and the jingling of the bullet casing against the cement became the only sound I could hear for miles. I kept watch through the scope, and a thin beam of moonlight shone through the broken window to show the unbloodied half of his face. I stared into his unblinking eye for what seemed like hours, trying and failing to slow my heartbeat, and then it happened. Slowly, soundlessly, a hand like a long bundle of twigs crept from the shadows, wrapped its gnarled talons over his face, his eyes still visible between them, and dragged him off into the darkness. Fuck this, I stuttered to myself. Fuck this. I disassembled the rifle as quickly as I could and returned it to the briefcase. I rushed down the stairs and headed for a back entrance, stashed the rifle in disguise in a hidden compartment beneath my car's back seat, and peeled out of the parking lot into the busy traffic. I would be leaving the city, disposing of the disguise, the badge, and the bullet casing, and never look back. Less than a week later, I read about the priest in the papers. Their description of the crime scene erased any doubts I might have had about the reality of that night. They said that they found his body gnawed near to the bone. They said that the damage was so severe that they had to identify him by dental records, and the gunshot wound was far from the focus of the story. Strangely, they also mentioned nothing about the ritualistic scene or the state of the room. The girl, apart from slight bruising and a state of shock, had apparently been left untouched. I thought I'd be safe if I could just run far enough away, but fleeing did me no good. I pulled quite a few jobs since that night, all across the country, never inclined to stay in one place for too long, and all of my marks shared the same fate. I poisoned a slumlord in New Jersey, and I heard about his vicious mauling in the evening news the following night. I slid a knife between the ribs of a heavy-handed bookie in Northern California a month later, and I watched the hands claw him from my grip and into the shadows before he even took his last breath. I heard them devour a mafioso's ex-wife in her own bedroom. I can still remember the smell that followed. You see, I kept that book, and I've tried many times to make sense of what happened that night. I don't understand much. I don't know what they are or what they want, but I have come across a damning revelation. Apparently, apart from the summoning, the ritual was just a formality. These things only require a mortal, any mortal, to take the life of another in their presence. They feed not on the dead, but on the murdered. And once fed, they follow the hand that fed them, demanding sacrifice again and again until the killer's life is done. The priest had defied them, and they were not pleased. I, however, did not, and they collected their meal by my hand. He invoked their wrath, and I don't know what would have become of him had I not pulled the trigger. However, his death was my first act of unwitting service, and now I don't know what will become of me if I stop. But I just can't send anyone else to that horrible fate. Until recently, I killed only for money. I justified my actions with the banality of evil. The idea that such things had become an inherent state of normality in society. I profited from death, but so did coffin salesmen and life insurance agents. People would kill one another with or without me. They'd murder each other for vengeance, petty theft, or their own self-righteous brand of justice. What made me so different? There was no guilt in the ordinary. Now that I've witnessed true evil, I can't justify my lifestyle that way anymore. I've seen what horrible things prey on us in life and in death, I've seen the dark forces that count on us to send each other to the grave, to do their work for them, and who hunger for us. I've seen what may await us in death, and I can no longer take a life so lightly. In living as I have, I wonder just how many I damned. I wonder if I ended the priest's suffering, or if I only sent him to an even worse torment. I can feel them growing restless. They're angry, but I've fed them for the last time, and I will no longer run. Whatever comes for me now, I can't help but feel deserving. For all those lives I have ended, I can think of no other way to make amends. God, forgive me. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm so very sorry.
Suicide Watch. Written by E. Matthews. Narrated by Brendan Bean. Featuring Steve Taylor, Rebecca Pisa, and Sungwon Cho. Produced by Luke Hodgkinson. Music by Brandon Boone. The light shining through the window burns my eyes, even though it is muted by the clouds. It's almost like a spotlight shining straight on my face. I hear the rustling of trees and the faint, soothing melody of rain on the glass. I don't know why I love the rain so much. I guess it was the only sound in the house I could listen to when my dad was beating my mother. Her screams still echo in my head. The inescapable sound of his repeated strikes still seemed to reverberate through the halls and off the hard wood. They found me with the rope around my neck and had me committed to Hillcrest, the local crazy house. I'm under suicide watch, which is not exactly the place to be on a Saturday. To be honest, I'd rather be dead. But look how that went. You can't always get what you want. Orderlies keep shuffling by, as if something is going on down the hall in Sophie's room. I leave my bed and make my way to the door, hearing more and more nurses and patients moving around the hall. I hear them being reassured that nothing is happening, but I see through their comforting lie. I can tell something bad has happened. So I poke my head out and look. If nothing were going on, there would not be 7 people huddled outside of Sophie's door. I see one nurse in tears. I recognize her. She's the redhead who spent a lot of time with Sophie. I always liked that nurse. She was pretty, and not to be that guy, but damn, she could be a model. That aside, the redhead was a little more patient than the other nurses. Sophie was an especially difficult case, as any schizophrenic would be. It took more than a calm smile, a stupid puzzle, or a game of checkers to take care of her. I imagine that the two were friends on the outside, maybe even family. As I step out into the hall, a male nurse looks at me and points back behind me, silently demanding that I step back into my room. But this isn't a dictatorship, and I'll take a fork in the ass before I take orders from a nurse.
Back to your room, Bobby.
He finally demands after enduring the coldest stare I could produce with my thick eyebrows. It's Robbie, I reply, although I'm not sure he knows the difference. He doesn't seem too bright to me.
Listen.
He steps closer to me, an admonishing look on his smug face.
It's important that you just stay in your room for now. We need to take care of something.
I ponder this for a moment as his gaze shifts from that of an authoritarian to one of actual concern, perhaps even regret. I know if I say what I am about to say too loudly, it could cause a panic. I'm sad but not crazy. I can hold it together. So out of consideration for the other patients, I lean in a little closer and speak quietly. Sophie's dead, isn't she? The look on his face expresses both anguish and discomfort at the same time. I am not stupid. If people crowd around a live patient, it could cause a lot of problems. It could overwhelm them, scare them, and cause their paranoia to intensify, culminating in a violent fit. No. Sophie couldn't handle that many people at one time. She was dead. The male nurse retreats with a sad look on his face and just walks away. He can't protect me from anything. Not when I can figure it out on my own. He knows I'm not a gossip either. I keep to myself mostly. I can't help but smile as he turns his back to me. It feels like a victory, like a triumph over an enemy. I understand why he's trying to contain me at first. What they should have done was put Sophie in a body bag on a gurney. They should have taken Sophie away before it caused a fuss. I don't know why they didn't. I walked towards Sophie's room. Schizophrenia aside, she was a sweet girl. Sophie was young. She was maybe 19, 3 years older than me. I remember a conversation I once tried to have with her about the economy. I had so many solutions and ideas. She didn't quite understand, so she changed the subject and started talking about cats. I wouldn't exactly call her my friend, but my stomach is still sick as I approach the door. It is a decision I regret immediately. I turn away from the disgusting mess and Ralph all over one of the nurse's scrubs. The redhead grabs me gently by my shoulders and moves me away. In any other situation, I would have pulled away from her grasp, but I wanted to leave this time. I only stared at it for a few seconds, and I know that the image will never leave me. It's like she exploded or turned inside out. Sophie's walls and ceiling drip with blood and chunks of flesh. Her intestines are roped around the room loosely, and her heart is in the hand of her skeleton. The pictures of cats on her wall are coated in gore and peeling off, and her skin is it's just gone. I understand now why they haven't done anything yet. They have no idea what to do. None of this makes sense. How could someone do this? And so quietly? Isn't it impossible? It takes a few minutes before I stop vomiting. I never imagined that this would be why the redhead nurse and I would be alone in the bathroom. It is sickening to even think about the fact that the mess in here was once a person. Sophie was a girl who loved cats. She loved drawing with markers and crayons like a kid. I look up from the toilet, my face red, veins bulging from my forehead. My face is dripping with snot and drool. I sit on the floor. The nurse is to my left with her hand on my shoulder. Her name tag, with a picture of her face, says her name is Melissa Wolf. I wipe my face in the sleeve of my white shirt and hang my head.
Are you all right, Robbie?
She asks me that, of all things. No, I reply sharply. My voice is nearly gone, but with what is left of it, I continue. I don't know what to make of it. The image plays through my head more and more, getting brighter, more vivid every time I blink. I see Sophie's shredded remains strewn everywhere in the room. Needless to say, I can't sleep tonight. Not without meds, anyway. Melissa, the redheaded nurse, gave me some pills before bed. I didn't know what they were, and I didn't care. I just threw them down my throat and shut up about it. As I lay here, hours after Melissa has gone, I hear a scratching sound coming from right outside of my door. I jump from my bed and slam my back to the wall. I shout, cursing whatever is on the other side of that door. Slowly, I slide down the wall and sit with my head in my knees, shaking in what? Fear? No, I think this is anger. I am angry at whatever took Sophie. I am angry at the fact that I ever survived the noose. I can't help but think, maybe I never wanted to die. Maybe I just wanted revenge. I transition from the floor to my feet and furiously open the door to find a cat. Just a cat. It's small and black, looking at me with its eyes half closed. Its tail sways left and right a couple times. It meows and runs down the hall in the direction opposite of Sophie's room. I step into the hall for the first time since the incident. I look to my left, towards Sophie's room, and hang my head in despair. After a moment of silence, I turn right and see the cat scratch at another door and look back at me, so I walk towards it. The door that the cat is scratching on provides access to a stairwell. It leads me down to the basement where the laundry room is. Or so I've heard. As I pass the front desk heading to the door, I have an eerie feeling. The place is empty. The nurses are gone. Usually, they have at least a few on staff at all times, but where are they? Moving slowly, constantly looking around me for any sign of people, I reach the door. The cat scratches at it one more time and then backs up to let me through. So I open it, and we head down into the basement. We go down a flight of stairs, through the laundry room and into what looks like a secondary infirmary. Is this normal? I don't know much about hospitals, but they usually keep their patients above ground. And this place is really clean. It's stocked with medicine and new equipment. I look to my left and see the cat perched atop a table. Beside it is a document inside of a file folder. I imagine that is why the cat is here. It is signaling and guiding me. I have no clue how it is possible, but I imagine I may find answers if I keep moving. So I grab the file and open it. It is Sophie's patient file. It has her full name, Sophie Ann Bishop. It says that she was a paranoid schizophrenic. Then it says the impossible. Cause of death, suicide. Whatever happened to Sophie, it clearly was not suicide. Nobody rips their own heart out of their chest, wraps their entrails around the room and self-destructs. Something's wrong here, very wrong. I noticed the cat leap from the table and jump to a counter. Next to the sink, taped to a cabinet door, is a letter of some sort. It has the name of the hospital, with the logo at the top. It's signed by Dr. Bill Marcus. I know Dr. Marcus. He's a good man. He seems very caring and always makes jokes to lighten the mood. I grab the note from the cabinet door and read it quietly to myself.
These incompetent nurses here at Hillcrest Mental Facility have absolutely no regard for procedure. They become emotionally involved with their patients. In the face of certain events, have no clue as to how they should react. They're not here to be their friends. They're here because our patients are sick. They can't handle the real world safely. The nurses treat them like real people. It's just wrong. The other day, I spoke with a spiky-haired young man with a near-erotic obsession with burning things. He says fire is essential to existence and loves to spread it in order to pay proper respect to the illuminating wonder that is fire. He worships fire like it's Baal. I can assure you, none of these people are capable of any normal way of thinking. I've subjected them to a new medication intended to alter their behavior. Well, the drug remains to be named, but after the success we've had with a paranoid schizophrenic named Sophie, I firmly believe that this new medication is a real game changer. Even our most violent and resilient subjects have become like doorstops. The human trials have been a complete success, and I will be secretly using the drug on half of the people within the facility.
What the hell? I can hardly breathe. It feels like I've been punched right in the stomach. We're not people here at Hillcrest. We're experiments. As I consider the letter for a moment, I recall Tom, the spiky-haired young man that the doctor referred to. Tom was an arsonist, and a good one at that. He and I recently had a discussion about fire. Dr. Marcus was right. He practically worshipped the stuff. Tom's brother snuck in some matches for me once so I could smoke. I don't know how they got them in through security, but I don't think I'd like the answer. I put a cigarette in my mouth. I am shaking so hard, I can barely light the damn thing. For whatever reason, I am afraid that I have taken the drug. I don't feel docile. I never was easily manageable anyway. I feel like if I see Dr. Marcus right now, I will tear him a new one. We're experiments. We're nothing but experiments. Then, I hear a loud stomping. I hear the rattle of thick, heavy chains and a faint groaning. Something big is headed my way. I put out the cigarette on my tongue and swallow it. I can't leave any real trace of me being here, and you can definitely smell the smoke. It is the most disgusting thing I've ever done, but I do it again. I hide in a small cabinet and close the door most of the way. I leave only a small crack to see out of. I have no idea where the cat is. The chains, the stomping of heavy feet, they get closer, closer, closer still until I can finally see him. It is a large man wrapped in gauze. He has large chains in his hand and around his shoulders. His face is riddled with stitches. His eyes are black and shark-like, lacking any trace of humanity. I can tell that this man has no soul. As he looks around, I can see he has no nose. I'd call that dumb luck. Eventually, after flipping over some tables and breaking everything at eye level, he turns and leaves. I wait until I can no longer hear him. I then slowly open the door and exit the cabinet. I am curious about what is going on in this hospital. Something is very wrong, and I know I have to leave. My curiosity gets the better of me. I search around to find the cat, but it's gone. I look around. Behind a broken glass cabinet, I notice an opening. It's a secret passageway. I push the cabinet the best I can. There's just enough room to squeeze into the opening. I shuffle through the glass and broken metal, getting small shards caught in my slippers. Then the lights go out. I move faster, and in my panic I trip, falling into what feels like a cavern of some kind. When I finally land, I feel a sharp pain as something punctures my left side. I feel it with my hand. It's a bone. It's not one of mine, though. I pull it out and feel blood trickle down my waist. It isn't a very deep wound, but it hurts. I need to see how bad it is, so I take out my matches again and light one. I pull up my shirt to reveal the wound. I am relieved to see it is just a bad scratch. When I look up, I'm stunned, frozen in fear. I stare Sophie in the face. She is like a ghost, with lifeless eyes rimmed in black. Her pupils are tiny. Where her eyes had once been green, they were now without color. Her face is more pallid than I recall. There is no doubt in my mind. This is Sophie Spector. Her mouth seems to be dripping thin, green ooze. The only things I recognize are her dark hair and the marks on her forehead from her habit of slamming her face into walls. She lifts her hand. She is holding 5 white pills, and slowly she looks down away from me. Her hand edges its way to my face. I try, but I am unable to speak. For whatever reason, she wants me to take these pills. I summon the courage to smack her hand away. As I do, I fall backwards into a pile of human skulls and bones. I freak and clumsily fumble about, trying to stand. When I am on my feet, she is once again right in front of me. This time, she is right in my face. She tries to push the drugs in my mouth. I cry a little as I yell at her, "No! I won't become like you. I have to stay alive." The words stop me. I step back, still crying at the realization. I never wanted to die. I just wanted a different life. Maybe even a second chance. A fresh start someplace far from here. Her ghost fades in a foggy flurry as large chains wrap around my neck and pull me down, flat on my face. I slam my head hard. I feel my cheekbone crack and my eye socket crumble a little. My nose gushes. I put one hand on the ground and try to stand. The chains pull again, and I am flung forward towards the large man I avoided in the infirmary. He grabs my throat over the chains and lifts me in the air. I kick my feet as I lose consciousness. I come to in a metal chair to discover that I am restrained by leather straps. I can't see out of my right eye. I can't smell anything or hear out of my right ear. My vision is blurry and my entire body is numb. My legs are numb and unresponsive. My heart speeds up as I hear lighter footsteps to my left. I hear a medical tray swing up next to me. When I hear the frighteningly warm laughter, I know who it is. "Dr. Marcus?" I ask, quietly trying not to choke on the blood in my mouth.
Well,
he replies,
"Look at you. Had a nice trip, I see. Sorry about the big guy. He can play a bit rough sometimes. What he did to that Sophie girl, it was just a bit much, wasn't it?"
"Why are you doing this?"
"It's simple, kid."
He moves the tray in front of me, and I see an eye in a jar. I just know it is mine.
You see? No pun intended. The people here aren't real people. They don't have real emotions, and nobody really cares about them. Most of our patients get dumped here and left to rot. No visitors, no friends, no family. They have nobody. I have an opportunity to be an innovator. I can forever alter the way these medical proceedings are executed. I can change the world. And you?
He grabs a scalpel from the tray, plays with it in his hand, and sets it back down. I try to wiggle out of the chair, but I appear to be paralyzed. I am helpless. Then he laughs. With such malice, he may as well be Satan himself. We were all blind to it. I scream as he grabs a large pair of scissors.
You tried to leave this world. I studied your file. You tried to hang yourself. But Mommy forgot her keys. You don't deserve this world, you crybaby. No one would be surprised if you, well, I don't know, snuck out for a smoke and jumped in front of a truck.
Why can't I move? What have you done to me?
Well, for starters, I removed your legs.
He cut something with the scissors. As his hand comes into sight, I can see he has taken a few of my fingers.
And then there are these.
He laughs once more, but much louder. Fear burns in me. If I wasn't sedated, I still wouldn't be able to move. I can tell that my head is strapped down as well. It almost makes sense to me now. I could never get inside of his head enough to understand why he's doing this. Still, it all falls into place. Unfortunately, I can do nothing. I watch in silence as he tears my body apart. He hacks my remaining fingers, and then an entire hand. It's almost like he wants to create more monsters like the freak that killed Sophie. I understand now why Sophie wanted me to take the pills. They would have killed me. It was a courtesy. But now I'm doomed to be like the large man with all of the stitches. Marcus will use the medicine to control me, and I won't care. I'm nobody. I was just going to die anyway.
Jillian. Written by Chris Mallory. Performed by Jesse Cornett. Featuring Joseph Gable, Alicia Pavlis, and Sariana Gregg. Audio production by Jesse Cornett. Music by Brandon Boone.
Liquid death boiled as the candle flame scorched the bottom of a silver spoon. Using a hypodermic needle, the alchemist loaded the poisonous brew into a syringe, leaving the impurities caught in a tiny ball of cotton. A black sweatshirt hung loosely off his body like a robe, the hood casting his sallow face in shadow. He twirled the needle in a bony hand, then poised the sharp tip over the track-marked arm of his most loyal customer. Jackson bit down on the end of the tourniquet tied around his bicep and pulled it tight. Like magic, the outline of thick veins protruded at the crook of his arm, each bulge scarred from abuse and infection. He nodded to the alchemist, and the needle penetrated his skin. Taking in a sharp breath, his jaw released the band, and the familiar burn began its journey. A soft moan reminded him that Jillian sat beside him. She reached out and stroked his shaved head, a syringe still stuck in her flesh, dangling like jewelry. Jackson turned to embrace her, but the first wave of the drug hit hard and sudden. A tsunami of pleasure swept him into the waiting arms of oblivion. The drug-induced dream played like a movie. Scenes flashed by as Jackson floated above himself, a mere spectator to the glimmer of nightmarish events. Jillian was on top of him. She kissed his neck and tore at his clothing. Her body gyrated and thrusted while the alchemist and several other afflicted souls sat around the drug house. The dead-eyed fiends groped at the two lovers, drool stretching from scab-covered lips. They walked together through the warm summer night, peering into parked vehicles as they went. Jillian stopped. She placed her finger to his lips. The wind blew back her long auburn hair, revealing a mischievous grin as she threw a stone through the side window of a caravan. Jackson dove in, slicing his already scarred arms on the shattered glass. He rifled through the center console. Then, Jillian tugged at his waist, cursing.
Shit! What the fuck? Shit, come on.
The car alarm had sent a man rushing like a minotaur from a nearby townhome. Jackson tried to brandish his weapon as a warning, though he had reacted too slowly.
Come on.
A fist landed a crushing blow against his face, knocking him aside.
Where do you think you're going, you bitch?
Jillian turned to run, but the man caught her by the dress, ripping it as he pulled her closer. His hands wrapped around her neck.
Come here, bitch.
Her complexion turned purple, tongue protruding from her gaping, soundless mouth. She clawed at the hands killing her. Knife in hand, Jackson rushed the man from behind. The spotlight of a circling helicopter swept the streets and alleys as sirens drew nearer. Out of breath, Jackson and Jillian ran into the front yard of a small cottage, his great-grandmother's house. He hid behind the bushes below a bedroom window. Sweat poured down his face as he used a blood-covered blade to pry out a familiar pane of glass. As a teenager, he had done that very same thing 100 times. Nana had forbidden him to see Jillian, so sneaking out was the only way they could spend time together. Red and blue lights illuminated the block as a police cruiser turned the corner. Jillian ducked behind Nana's thick lilacs. Jackson took a chance and climbed up the stucco. He tumbled through the window into his childhood bedroom. Then, he quickly reached down and took Jillian's hand, pulling her up the wall just as the spotlight from the cruiser scanned the house. They held their breath. Jackson wondered what prison would be like. He imagined officers kicking down his great-grandmother's door, guns drawn. They would rip Jillian from his arms and carry him away in cuffs. The blood on his hands was proof enough. Jackson couldn't handle the thought of never seeing Jillian again. Maybe the cops would shoot them both dead. At least then they would still be together. The purr of the engine faded as the police continued their search. Jillian let out a relieved sigh, and Jackson pulled her close, breathing in her scent. His heart rate slowed as the high tapered.
As long as she is mine, everything will be all right,
he thought. He found comfort in the sound of her steady breathing and slipped into the waiting darkness. Though he slept, part of him felt Jillian's warmth fade in the night. Shortly thereafter, the screaming began. Jackson was startled from a bad dream by Jillian kicking him in the ribs. In the nightmare, Nana had been calling for him. though he'd wanted to go to her, his body had refused to obey.
Jack, get up.
Jillian kicked him again. He swatted her away, wanting to slip back to sleep, but his arms were too weak to defend.
Jack.
He mumbled.
Let me be.
Jack, get up. We have to go. We're in real trouble, baby.
I'm tired.
Voice trembling, Jillian said,
This is bad. This is really, really bad.
Lifting his head from the floor, a sliver of sunlight shining through the crack in the curtains triggered an unbearable pounding in Jackson's skull. The left side of his face stung from temple to chin. His entire body throbbed. Worse, the sickness churned the rotting contents of his stomach. He needed a bump more than he had ever needed anything in his life. Confused, he glanced around the room at various baseball trophies and first-place blue ribbons, all of which had his name inscribed in gold leaf. His eyes went wide.
How did we get to Nana's?
Jillian sighed and fell backwards on the bed like a rag doll. She shook her head. Flashes from the previous night came crashing back.
No.
Jackson thought, noticing the dried red stains on his hands.
Jill, you alright?
He rolled onto his knees and brushed her hair from her pale face. Voice barely audible, she said,
Dead.
It was self-defense. That guy was going to kill you.
Jackson thought about the beast that had attacked them. He strained to remember what happened, but a thick fog covered his memories. All he recalled was slashing and stabbing like a madman, doing everything in his power to protect Jillian.
Besides,
he added,
we don't know for sure that he's dead.
Not him.
Jillian said, her eyes dark and unsettling.
While you slept, I killed the thing pretending to be your grandmother.
Jackson swallowed hard.
What?
Jillian stared at him. The weight of her words felt too real, too dark to be a ruse. Nana couldn't hear very well. She wouldn't have known someone had broken into the house unless one of them had left the room during the night. Jillian's hands trembled, and her blue sundress was damp with sweat and blood.
Show me,
he said, doing his best to hold back the sickness screaming, to be free of his throat.
We should leave, baby.
We will, but first I need to see for myself. I hope you just had a nightmare too.
Jillian nodded. She stood and led him from the safety of his childhood treasures. Splintered wood, what was left of the coffee table, was strewn about the living room. The sofa and recliners were overturned. The old television had been smashed, a phantom image still rolling underneath the static. The entire room, even the ceiling, was speckled red.
I saw her for what she was. I used your knife, but she didn't die easily,
Jillian said. In a state of shocked disbelief, Jackson ignored her and followed a trail of gore to the basement door. The steps descended into pitch black. He tried the light switch, clicking it off and on, but the darkness simply laughed at him. A ghostly cry echoed from the grim depths.
Help, Nana. Jackie, help me.
Jackson blinked at the reaching shadows.
What do you mean she didn't die easily? Jill, what did you do?
Nana's voice wasn't real. Hallucinations were common with his mix of narcotics, but this all felt different. Like a fading dream trying to come back. He pinched himself hard enough to prove he wasn't still dreaming. Jillian crept up behind him with a flashlight and shined it down the stairwell.
Look,
she said. At the bottom, a chalky white foot with long yellow nails rested in a pool of congealed blood. Jackson thought he saw the dead toes twitch. He tried to convince himself it was just a trick of the light.
You've seen them, Jack.
Jillian said.
When death courses through your veins, the truth becomes clear. But she was different. Something was wrong with her. It wasn't your grandmother.
The hair raised on his arms. Jackson couldn't deny that he knew what she meant. Sometimes people are more than they appear. A picture of the alchemist formed in his mind. He shook the thought away, then slowly descended the creaking stairs. Nothing in his life as a degenerate drug addict had prepared him for the carnage in the basement.
Oh, Christ,
he said. The woman who had raised him lay desecrated in a pool of black gel. The skin of her arms and legs had been sliced open, exposing the muscle and tendons beneath. She had been scalped. The white of the skull perfectly matched the white of her rolled back eyes. Her neck had been slashed open, and her tongue had been pulled through the wound in a grotesquely comical manner.
She didn't die easily, Jillian? You fucking flayed her!
A monster wore her skin, I swear. Baby, let's take the rest of the jewelry and go. No one knows we were here.
Jillian dangled a necklace in front of the flashlight. Clasped to the thin silver chain was a heart-shaped pendant, adorned with a translucent black diamond. The light refracting through the gemstone created nightmarish shadow creatures that danced along the walls of the stairway.
I'm keeping this one,
she continued.
It's special. You can pawn the rest.
She turned away, leaving Jackson alone in the dark.
No. Anna. I'm sorry, Nana. Jillian didn't mean to hurt you. It was the dope.
He cried to the dissected corpse.
Please forgive us.
Eyes adjusting to the darkness, Jackson stared at the mangled body. Her wrinkled face reminded him that she had lived a long life. He wasn't sure how old Nana had been, certainly over 90. Maybe over 100. He remembered the day they'd met. Jackson was 7, and Nana had stood next to him at his mother's freshly dug grave. Even then, she had seemed ancient.
You shall come live with me, Jackie,
she had said.
I raised your mother and your mother's mother. I taught them to take proper care of their bodies. But silly children always refused to listen.
Tears welled at the edge of her eyes, but her voice grew furious.
Opium. A ridiculous way to die. Things will be different this time. Yes, very different. Now come along, child.
Nana had grabbed his hand and pulled him away from the casket. She had worn that heart-shaped diamond pendant. In fact, he had never seen her without it around her neck. Now, her neck was practically gone. Nana deserved better. But what could be done? She was dead, and he believed it was all his fault.
I'm sorry.
Jackson turned away and raced up the stairs after Jillian. Room by room, they tore through bookshelves and drawers looking for anything of value. Jackson found a revolver under Nana's mattress. He flicked open the cylinder. It was loaded. After slapping it closed again, he stuffed it into his jeans. Jillian emptied the jewelry boxes into a duffel bag. It would be enough to keep them high for a very, very long time.
Will it be enough to make us forget what we've done?
Jackson wondered.
One more thing. Then we can go.
Jillian said, walking into the kitchen. Jackson followed. After extinguishing the stove's pilot light, she turned on all the burners. The rancid smell of natural gas quickly drove them from the house. Jillian sought refuge at the only place they were welcome. The alchemist allowed them to hide out in the condemned house and kept them supplied with as many drugs as they could handle, providing they forked over cash, of course. Jackson pawned all the stolen goods, save for the necklace and gun. Money wasn't a problem, but the explosion in the suburbs was all over the news.
Good evening, I am Brock Sanders. A large explosion today rocked the southwest block of the Fremont Avenue area. Arson is suspected. There was significant damage to adjacent houses. Authorities are investigating, but no suspects have been arrested.
To his relief, the newscasters made no mention of the mutilated old woman the police had surely found in the basement. He hoped the whole thing would be forgotten in a few days. The alchemist claimed the police had listed Jackson as a person of interest, that his face was plastered on flyers stapled to telephone poles around the city. Worried one of their friends would give them up.
Jill, you're not fucking thinking. We're not safe here. The police are either going to come looking, or worse, these people are going to give us up. How can you trust them?
Jackson begged Jillian to skip town. Perhaps find a place to hide in the forest.
I don't know where we'll go. We can go hide in the woods, or we'll get on a train, and we'll just ride it.
Pressing another needle into her arm, she said,
Where'd we go, baby? We don't know how to survive outside of the city. Besides, we've got to be close to our medicine. This is the best place for us. Unless the cops tack on a reward, we'll be safe here.
She nodded out before Jackson could protest. Safe wasn't a term he would use to describe the den of horrors in which they were trapped. Addicts came and went all hours of the night, most too strung out to know what was going on, yet still capable of spilling someone's guts if it meant them securing another fix. The alchemist couldn't be trusted either. Jackson had caught him greedily eyeing the necklace that Jillian refused to take off. Jillian was the worst of them all. She was different somehow, completely despondent most of the time. After spiking a vein, she would sit on the floor staring at the rats crawling around the discarded containers of rotten food, while other beasts with beady red eyes stared back from the holes in the walls. For hours, she mumbled to herself, slowly rocking back and forth.
You can see what happens. You don't see. It's in front of me, and I can feel everything that's going through my body, and I know.
Jackson wanted to escape the trauma of that night, but not through the needle. Dope was like quicksand, though, and Jillian seemed as if she preferred to sink. He tried to keep his head clear and discovered how difficult it was to fight the sickness. He might have found the strength if not for Jillian tempting him back to the dark side. When Jackson was coherent, Jillian acted as if he were invisible. He hated it, but he realized she was lost in the real world. They could only be together in that fantasy realm where consequences never matter. And Nana wasn't dead. So once again he rolled up his sleeve and accepted the alchemist's terms of surrender. Stoned out of their minds, they sat next to each other on a stained mattress in the graffiti-covered bedroom. The lock didn't work and junkies would stumble in from time to time. Jackson had to fight them off, threatening them with his knife
Get
or
out.
pistol.
You so much as fucking touch her, you're dead. Take one more fucking step and I will blow a goddamn hole in your head. Get the fuck out. Get the fuck out right now.
During the night, the bravest pressed their luck. They crept in, hungry, for a piece of Jillian, only to retreat when she attacked them like a rabid wolf. She was always ready, happy to rip flesh from bone. After each attempted assault, she seemed more alive, more like her old self. Then the needle would come out again and she would regress, back to mindless mumbling, the siren-like chant forcing Jackson to join her.
I need to feel this. Stop. No.
Drinking condensed soup directly from cans and sipping brown water from the bathroom sink barely kept their bodies alive. It seemed that every day Jackson poked a new hole into his belt. As for the drugs, Jackson had reached his peak. He worried the next shot might be his last, and only took enough to keep the sickness at bay. Jillian, however, refused to slow down. Spurred on by the violence of ripping another addict's face to shreds, she pulled the syringe from her purse, then loaded the biggest fix that he had ever seen. Jackson wanted to stop her, but the alchemist had already injected a dose of death into his arm.
Don't,
he uttered. Jillian grinned.
Nana told me to do it.
Nana,
Jackson thought. He had loved her so much. She had been his family once. Consciousness dimming, he watched the massive hit flow into Jillian's ravaged vein, and then the darkness took him. The next morning, he found her lying in the tub, puke dripping from her chin, bugs crawling over her body. He swept the roaches off her cold flesh, picked her up by the arms, then dragged her back into the bedroom.
come on, wake up, Jillian!
Jackson draped her arm over his shoulder and held most of her weight.
Jillian, come on!
He tried to get her to walk around the room.
Jillian, wake up!
He slapped her face.
Come on, you have to move!
Let me feel this. No, I can't.
She protested, but Jackson wouldn't relent until she was mostly taking steps on her own.
You almost died!
She laughed.
So?
After that, the days and nights blurred together. Regardless of the way Jackson struggled to curb her use, Jillian kept injecting herself with ever-increasing amounts. During the day, he watched her closely, making sure she stayed away from the alchemist. Eventually, he needed to get himself right. Then, while he was too high to stop her, she purposely overdosed once more. Again and again, Jackson revived her. Jillian's temperature never was as warm as it should have been, and her complexion never changed back from the sickly gray color. He hadn't witnessed anything like it before. No matter what he tried, her usage increased, and so did her madness. What had begun as drug-fueled mumblings had turned into full-blown rants.
Her face, they were piercing through me. You need to understand that there are monsters like this out there, and they are trying to take what's ours.
During her worst bouts, Jillian raved to the junkies about Jackson's dead great-grandmother.
She was not a grandmother. She was not a grandmother. She was evil.
They listened to her preach, nodding along in agreement when she claimed that a wraith haunted her, that the old woman never left her side, no matter how deep
a wraith.
she stuck the needle.
She was following me. She's still here. She's still here. She's still haunts me and she talks to me and I can't get rid of her. That wraith, that monster, she haunts me. No matter how deep I let the needle
Jackson
sink
had
in,
enough.
she's still here.
Using a roll of duct tape, he tied her up, binding her hands behind her back. It was the only way he knew to protect her. The intervention didn't work. After he had fallen asleep, she broke free and purchased more dope. The alchemist was always happy to oblige a paying customer. Distraught, Jackson finally gave up.
She needs to hit rock bottom. Then she'll let me save her,
he thought. Though he despised himself, he refused to interfere with Jillian's downfall any longer. He turned away from her pain, like every junkie turns away from his or her own suffering. Even when the infection set in and the wounds on her arms festered, he remained silent. Even when bone and tendons were exposed, maggots biting at the dead skin, he kept himself on the outskirts of her insanity. Still, she refused to stop, shooting up whenever she could. All the while, she rubbed at the gem around her neck and swore Nana was a monster.
The monster, she haunts me.
When the money dried up, the alchemist's goodwill disappeared. Jillian refused to trade him the heart-shaped necklace,
You can't have this. This is mine. It's mine. You can't have.
and they were forced back onto the streets.
I need more. Jack, you don't understand. I need more. I need more.
She pounded her fists into his chest.
You promised. You promised you would take care of me.
Jillian's plea finally broke him.
How?
He screamed, ashamed.
You won't let me!
Find a way.
Without any other options, Jackson suggested that they fall back on the oldest hustle in history until he could find a more permanent solution to their problems. Jillian agreed. She promised him no matter what happened, this time would be the last time. Jackson knew it was a promise that wouldn't be kept, but lying to himself had always been so much easier than accepting the truth. Jackson sat at the bar staring at a reflection he resented. A machine pumped smoke that swept across the neon-lit floor. Crumpled dollar bills littered the small stage. The music pulsed through his body, reminding him of the first time the alchemist had opened his vein.
We got a treat for you tonight,
the DJ said into the microphone.
Please give it up for Anastasia.
Jillian walked around the stage to the beat of a kick drum. Holding on to the dance pole, she leaned back and looked out over the crowd. The strobe lights flashed on the heart-shaped diamond pendant.
That girl's something, isn't she?
Jackson asked the man on the stool next to him, amazed at how Jillian's makeup hid the worst of the damage. Long, white satin gloves covered the places where the flesh had rotted away. She was gorgeous. Jackson remembered how she had looked in high school, back before drinking led to pills, pills to powder, and powder to needles. The man sipped his drink, transfixed on Jillian's swaying hips. She slipped out of her dress. Her naked body twisted like a serpent around the pole. Jackson leaned closer to the man, breathing in the smell of cigarettes mixed with cheap cologne.
Anastasia told me she'd like to get to know you better. She said you could have her. She said you could do whatever you want.
The man sat in silence, still mesmerized. Jackson waited. He knew better than to press. When the song was over, Jillian collected the money on the stage, then walked back behind the red curtain. The man downed the rest of his drink, head bowed and spinning a gold wedding band between his fingers. He seemed to contemplate the offer. After a moment of silence, he whispered,
How much?
Smoking a cigarette outside the hotel room door, Jackson listened as the headboard crashed into the wall over and over again. A fake moan of pleasure following each thud. Jackson stared contemptuously at the cars going down the block, the drivers scanning for a date. Everyone knew the place charged by the hour.
One day, it will all be behind us,
he thought. He crushed out the cigarette and banged on the door.
Time's up, pal. Get dressed and get out.
When the headboard continued to thud, but the moaning had stopped, Jackson cursed under his breath.
God damn it.
He threw open the door, drawing the gun from his waistband, leveling it at the back of the man's head. And he said,
I told you to get out!
The man lay on top of Jillian, shaking. She clawed at his back with one hand. Long trails of blood oozed through the sheets. Jackson swung, striking him in the head with the barrel. The man did not stop. Jillian cackled. Her other hand was wrapped around the man's windpipe, holding him on top of her. The man had been struggling to free himself, but was trapped between her legs.
Let him go!
She released his neck, thrust her fingers deep into his eye socket, and pulled his face down. The pillows muffled his scream. Jackson grabbed him by the arm and threw him to the floor. Blood flowed down his chest from the puncture wounds in his throat. His dislodged eye rolled across his cheek, dangling by a thread of optic nerves. Jillian lunged after the man. Jackson grabbed her by the hair and threw her back on the bed. A tuft of flesh ripped free from her scalp. Jillian kicked back the bloody sheets and smeared the red gore over her breasts. A low-pitched growl rumbled from her parted lips.
Jillian, stop!
The man tried to pull himself up, but slipped in the growing puddle of blood. The eye slid back and forth across his face.
She tried to kill me!
Jackson kneeled. He pressed his hand to the wound in the man's neck, but when the blood continued to pulse between Jackson's fingers, he shook his head. The man's terrified expression told Jackson that he knew it was the end. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. His limp hands fell from Jackson's wrists, and his head lolled forward. The eye in the socket seemed to be locked on Jillian, still rubbing his blood all over her body, while the other stared at the bloody carpet.
Wrap him up in the shower curtain and leave him in the bathroom,
she said.
Why the fuck did you do that?
Jackson clenched his fists. He stood and turned towards her. Jillian traced a bloody circle around her navel.
To feel alive.
I can't help you on my own. We need real help.
Help? I'm okay, Jack. Nana is with me. She was lying in the bed next to me the whole time that monster had his way.
She laughed.
Besides, you can't blame me. Nana told me to do it.
We have to run far, far away. Somewhere people won't know us. Rehab.
Jillian laughed again.
We can get through it if we stay together,
Jackson said. She shook her head.
It's too late for that.
No, it's not. We'll get clean. We'll find work. Rent an apartment.
Be a family. Please, Jill. We can break free from this madness.
I said it's too late, Jack. Look.
Jillian held up her left hand, waving it like a magician. With her right, she dug her fingernails into her wrist, hooking a vein with her thumb. She slowly pulled out the long strand, then reached for another. Jackson retched.
Oh my God.
There's no pain. I don't feel anything anymore. Do you want to know the truth about your grandmother, baby?
Jillian caressed the gem around her neck.
Nana told me everything. She was already dead. Had been for a long time before we broke in that night. Now I'm dead too. I'm a monster wearing Jillian's skin. And her rotting flesh itches so badly.
Don't say that! You are just dope sick. We can get through this, I promise. Everything is going to be alright.
Jackson laid his head on her breasts, and she cradled him in her arms. Her body was so cold and her heart beat so slowly that he wasn't sure if he could really hear it at all.
Nana forgives you for what you did. I forgive you too. And I love you, Jillian.
She doesn't forgive me. She said I took away her link to life, and now she's punishing me like a silly child. I don't care, though. Because the necklace is mine.
Jillian slid from Jackson's embrace. Blood glistened on her naked body as she limped across the room to her purse. The makeup had been smeared away in different places, exposing the bruised flesh beneath. Jackson could only watch as she cooked up the last bit of her stash and injected it directly into her neck. Pupils constricted to pins. She crawled across the bloody floor like a wounded animal. Jackson cringed as she pulled herself back into the bed and cuddled next to him.
Wake me from the nightmare when you're ready to leave, Jack. We can sell his wedding ring to buy more death.
Jackson held her cold body for hours, staring across the room at the dead man, eyes unblinking. He wasn't sure if the stench came from the corpse or from Jillian. All his life, he had never subscribed to the supernatural. He wanted to believe her affliction was a combination of mental and physical illness, some sort of disease that doctors could treat, though his mind couldn't rationalize the way she had changed. The things he had seen defied all logic. His last hope was to accept that something, some dark force, had power over her.
Jillian,
he whispered. When she didn't respond, he thought of his great-grandmother.
Nana? You were an addict just like the rest of us, weren't you?
He traced the black heart pendant with his finger before gripping it tightly in his palm. Jackson yanked the necklace, breaking the silver chain. Jillian lurched forward, eyes wide and bloodshot. She clawed at her chest, screaming in inhuman retching sounds. Jackson clasped his hands to his ears in an effort to drown out the horror. The piercing howl went on forever. Deja vu struck, and he remembered hearing the same horrific scream from that night. Jillian must have ripped the pendant from Nana's neck. Eventually, her lungs gave way. She sank back to the bed, a slight smile lingering on her blue lips. Jackson pulled her closer. Her muscles clenched under his hands. Spasms contorted her into a twisted mess. Her body twitched and lurched, spine cracking as her back arched further and further backward. After what seemed like an eternity, Jillian finally went still. Jackson cried. He wondered again about the diamond clamped in his hand. It held life somehow. Why would such a thing exist? For what evil purpose? A word passed through his mind, though he didn't know the meaning or where the thought had come from.
Revenants.
Like all addicts, Jackson refused to confront the reality of a lost supply. Wiping away the blood in tears, he said,
I don't care what you are, Jill. I need you.
He told himself that he could learn to control her, to mask the rotting flesh, and to curb her dark urges. He put the pendant back around her neck and waited. When Jillian did not stir, dread set in. He called her name,
Jillian.
But she did not answer.
Jillian.
He shook her,
Jillian.
But she would not wake.
Jillian, come on, baby, please wake up. Come on, come on, come on.
He tried again and again. There was only cold death.
Jillian!
Jackson screamed. He begged for her to come back. He pleaded for the life together that they had always planned.
Stay with me, baby girl.
All the while, he knew it was too late. Hard and fast, they had lived the junkie lifestyle. Their relationship had always been destined to end in suffering.
There has to be a way. There has to be a way. There has to be a way. There has to be a way,
he thought. His mind went through a dozen impossible scenarios, as if life were a fairy tale, and the sleeping princess could still be saved.
Not like this. Not like this. No, not like this.
In the real world, he found only one option: suicide. Jackson placed the gun barrel to his temple. While looking over Jillian's lifeless body, he took in his last breath, his eyes pausing on the sparkling black gem. Suddenly, he knew the answer. Jackson lowered the gun and kissed Jillian for the final time.
This isn't goodbye,
he said, then fled the motel with the heart-shaped pendant firmly grasped in his palm. Jackson stumbled through the dark alleys of a city he no longer recognized. Shuffling through the dredges, he stared at the nickels and dimes in his palm. It wasn't enough, no matter how many times he counted.
25, 50, 75, $25. God fucking damn it. Come on.
It wasn't enough.
Fuck.
The rules had changed. Money could no longer pay for what he needed. Looking for his next fix, he considered breaking into a car, maybe a house, if he could gather the nerve.
No, fucking God, come on. I could smash into a car. Still fucking radio. That might work. Yeah, that might work. Yeah, okay.
He thought. The alternative was doing what he had promised himself he would never do again, and the memory brought a horrible taste to his mouth. He shuddered. Promises, after all, were meant to be broken. Now that Jackson no longer used a needle, he simply went through the motions, living life on the streets because it was the only life left for someone like him. He still sought a high, though he had finally come to terms with the fact that it was never the dope he craved. What he needed was something else altogether. His true addiction cost him more and was harder to come by than anything the other wandering addicts could possibly imagine. Each day, he forced himself a little farther down the path to hell for a chance to get closer to the demons he desired. Each deed slightly more horrific. But when the feeling came, Christ, it felt so good. A silhouette appeared in the alley. surrounded by a dim, red glow cast down by the neon sign of the strip club. Jackson stepped back into the cover of darkness, terrified. He listened closely. The figure came toward him, footsteps growing louder and louder, then stopped suddenly in front of the shadow of the dumpster.
Buying or selling?
The man asked. Jackson knew the voice. His heart raced, but he did not move from the darkness.
You can't hide from me.
The voice was gruff, as if the man had smoked 2 lifetimes worth of cigarettes. Jackson was cornered. It was impossible to escape with the way his limbs were shaking. Besides, why run? Nothing could hurt him anymore. He took a hesitant step out of the darkness, feeling the strands of long, dingy hair stuck to his face, wet from perspiration. Or worse. Though his clothing was ragged, the t-shirt and jeans stained so badly that the original colors could not be guessed. Jackson wore the dirty tatters of a brown corduroy jacket, almost proudly.
Buying,
he said.
Oh, you look a mess, boy.
Jackson shrugged. Yes, he was a mess. He should go home and clean up. When had Nana thrown him out, anyway? Months? Years? Or decades ago? He couldn't remember how long he had been on the streets, but he still remembered Nana's expression when she found out Jillian had turned him into a junkie.
Jillian.
The alchemist, much older than Jackson remembered, stared through him with unreadable eyes. Jackson anxiously shifted his weight from foot to foot. The itch was growing stronger, the urge more intense, the scabs on his face driving him insane. He reached up and scratched until his fingers came away wet, exposing the part of skull above his right eye in the process. The alchemist took a step back.
It's been a real long time. Guess you've been shooting up without me.
No!
Then what happened with that girl of yours?
You wouldn't believe me if I told you.
The alchemist laughed.
Well, I still got what you need,
he said.
But you ain't got nothing I want,
he added, looking Jackson over from head to toe. Jackson's skin crawled again, but it wasn't from the withdrawals. He shoved his hands into his coat pockets. Soon, Jackson thought. The fix is coming soon.
Maybe you do,
the alchemist said, and pointed at Jackson's chest. Jackson looked down at the black heart pendant hanging around his neck. Footsteps approached from behind. Ah, yes. Finally. Nana stepped up to his left, her tongue still pulled through her neck, twitching. Jillian stepped to his right, her head twisted back from rigor mortis, skin several shades of black decay.
What do you say then? Trade?
The alchemist asked, holding up a bag of death.
Do it, Jackie. Do it. Do it. Do it.
Nana whispered. Jillian's grip tightened on his arm, and in turn, his hand tightened around the pistol.
We're family now, right?
Jackson pleaded, the gun sliding out of his pocket.
Oh, yeah, Jack. Of course we're family.
The alchemist said as he walked toward Jackson, with a needle gripped in a pale, bony hand.
Chilling tales for dark nights.